I'm going to reintroduce myself. I know many of the people at this conference, but my situation has changed in the past year. I'm currently the Chief Executive Officer of a consultant company called ThinkBox.digital. But in my past, I've done a lot of other things, all involving curation, digital preservation. I started in 1992 at the Museum of the American Indian, which is part of the Smithsonian Institution. I worked for a small software company which does collections management databases for museums, gallery systems. I was a systems analyst at the American Museum of Natural History's Anthropology Division, where I ran their digital imaging program. I was a digital preservation analyst at the National Library of New Zealand, and most recently, in the position most of you will have known me under, I was a policy analyst at the United States National Archives and Records Administration. And in that role, I've been a member of TC-171 SC2 since about 2011. I'll have to check with Betsy on the exact date that I joined. And I'm currently the convener for WG5, which oversees PDFA. So a little bit about ThinkBox Digital. In the past, when I was a government employee, we'd start off our presentations saying we're not authorized to speak on behalf of the National Archives. And today, it's like I'm talking about digital preservation and PDF, but I can't speak for the digital preservation community. I'm now a part of a consultant company interested in digital preservation and electronic records management. And a couple of my former NARA colleagues and I are having a go, including Lisa Haralampus and Greg Lepore. And our goal is to help vendors improve their products with an eye towards digital preservation and archiving. And also for small organizations who may not have the resources to hire digital preservation experts, we'd like to lend our expertise to them as well.
Are you involved with FADGI as well?
I was. No, I'm no longer in the government, so I'm tangentially still involved with some FADGI stuff that I'll talk about in a little bit later on. Okay, so my talk today, as I said, I can't speak on behalf of the digital preservation community, but I've been involved in it for a long time. I've also been involved in the PDF community for a long time, and so some things have dawned on me about what's going on in those places. And if you're familiar with digital preservation, you may know that there's been, PDFA hasn't always been embraced as a desirable format. So today we're going to look at how digital preservation theory and practice have evolved. The preservation model that was in effect back in 2005 when PDFA is released, PDFA1, a lot of the exciting changes that have taken place in the PDF landscape, which I find incredibly exciting and leave me feeling that there's a very bright future for PDFA as a target format for digital preservation. So I will say it's interesting following an AI expert. I've had a relationship with AI and trying to put this presentation together. And one of the first things I did was ask a model to develop a timeline for PDF. And it did. And it got every date wrong. Which is interesting because the dates are often incorporated into the standard publication. But here, I'm just going to call out some of the important ones. 1993 in the opening Star Wars credit. It's hard for me to remember that far back. They asked me when was my first interaction with PDF, and I'm going to have to give some thought to that. For the purposes of this talk, 2001 and PDF 1.4, which forms the basis in 2005 of PDFA1 or 19,000-1. Obviously, the release of PDF 2.0 in 2011 is an important date. For this talk, again, in 2012, PDFA3, which allowed for arbitrary attachments in PDFA files, is important. And then I pointed 2020, PDFA4 is significant because it opened up PDFA to a new content type, 3D content. So now let's look at digital preservation. And thinking back on it, digital preservation as a concept really starts in the late 90s, and I kind of arbitrarily picked 1999 as the start date for this talk. And Interpares was and is an international research project into digital preservation, and a lot of the reports that have come out have formed the basis of the theories and practices that we see today. I call out in 2000 METS, which is a Library of Congress standard. It stands for Metadata Encoding and Transmission, which has been incorporated now into a lot of repositories for how they package and describe content. 2002 is significant. DPC just stands for the Digital Preservation Coalition, kind of formalizing the community. But PRONOM is a format registry developed by the National Archives of the UK. And that kind of shows the importance that collecting institutions place on what format is content encoded in, recognizing that if they need to preserve it for long periods of time, they need to understand these encodings. In 2003, OIIS, which stands for Open Archival Information Standard, is released. And interestingly, it's not developed by the digital preservation community, but rather NASA and the European Space Agency. But it was developed to preserve space data and has gone on to form the kind of underpinnings of digital preservation repositories today. JHOVE, many of you may be familiar with, it's the JSTOR Harvard Object Validation Environment. But again, it's a tool for repositories to identify content based on its encoding and then validate it to see, is it a good representation of that format that it purports to be? LOCKSS is a preservation environment. It stands for Lots of Copies Keep Stuff Safe. And so that's one method of ensuring preservation through time, make lots of copies of something. 2005 marks the release, again by the Library of Congress, of a preservation metadata dictionary, PREMIS. And I'm going to talk more about PREMIS as we go through this. But it's significant, along with METS, in that it gave collecting repositories a language to use to describe how they're preserving content. 2006, I could just put the cloud there, but that marks the release of AWS and Google Docs. And we're going to come back to that date and Google Docs because it marks kind of a fundamental shift in the nature of file formats away from binary blobs on a hard drive to these cloud-based systems. 2007, Bagot is interesting because it accomplishes a lot of the same things that PDF does. And you can think of it, if you're not familiar, it's kind of like a zip file with a metadata manifest describing the contents. And it was developed so that repositories could share data with one another and move things between systems. 2009 represents the commercial availability of dedicated digital preservation repositories. And I use the example of Preservica, but also Ex Libris' Rosetta, and there are others. And ERA is the National Archives of the United States Electronic Records Archive, which was rolled out over a number of years, but we can accept that 2009 kind of fits in there. 2014, blockchain becomes a thing, and the digital preservation community is still kind of wrestling where does this fit in. And we're going to talk a lot, and I think there will be a lot of conversations this week about content provenance and authenticity. And blockchain was looked at as a method of ensuring the authenticity of content. And then 2022, ChatGPT and AI. And I was talking earlier with some colleagues. This is my first presentation that I've done not as a NARA employee in a long time. And as somebody at the National Archives, we have this kind of library of slide decks. If I'm giving a presentation, you go back through and pull out relevant slides, put them all together.
So I felt this pressure starting from scratch that if I'm doing it manually, I must be wasting my time. I should be using AI because everything I have is throwing AI tools at me. So I did what I thought was I asked AI a softball question. In the United States, we have baseball where you throw the ball very hard. Softball, you just kind of lob it up there so it's easy to hit. So I really did think. I was using PowerPoint, and it has Copilot built in, and all I did was say, make me a double helix of these two timelines. And this is what I got. So, obviously, I have a lot of work to do on my prompting. Maybe Microsoft has some work to do. I don't know. But suffice to say, there's no double helix in this presentation. So apologies for that. So the topic today I talked about is going to be looking at what happened in 2005 while PDFA is being developed, and then also what's going on in the digital preservation world, and then what has changed in the intervening time up till 2025. So if we agree that digital preservation begins in the late 90s, and this may not represent everywhere, but it represents a lot of the institutions that I worked for. Early practices included something I refer to as normalization and then bit preservation. And normalization means that you take whatever the formats that people are using day to day and you convert them to a small number of known good formats. And those are what you choose to preserve. I give two very different examples of how this was done. And NAA is the National Archives of Australia, and they actually developed a utility called Xena, where with different modules supporting different original format types. So if you had, say, a WordPerfect file or a Word .doc file, you would throw it at Xena, and they would output an OpenOffice file because that was considered to be a preservable format for the future. At the National Archives and Records Administration, where I worked, they took a similar but different approach in that they released transfer guidance which specified 13 formats that federal agencies could use when transferring permanent records for preservation. And the end result was if they created content in other formats, they were expected to do the normalization themselves. Agencies like the Department of Justice and the FBI use WordPerfect. NARA didn't accept WordPerfect. We specified PDF 1.4. The transfer guidance was released right around 2005, so PDF A1 wasn't existed yet. And then in terms of preserving those normalized files, it was done in offline storage media, DLT tapes, CD or DVD media, and then through time LTO, pick a tape type, chosen for capacity and durability. And it's like how much space could you afford? How long would it take to write to it? And then once you had it on a tape, you put it on a shelf and you left it there, and you would refresh it at some period, typically every 5 years. Today, what does that sound like? It sounds like backing things up, not preserving things in the way we would call it today. You had a poor ability to identify formats, hence the desire to normalize down to things that you did know. And you couldn't, in real time, monitor for alteration or corruption that might occur. And conversions between formats introduces lots of risks to the authenticity of the record. So let's shift over to PDF A1. And I will say, I joined ISO TC 171 back in 2011. But I followed in the footsteps of a predecessor, Susan Sullivan, and in pointing out some of these things, I don't know if there are problems with PDF A1 or whatever, but NARA was at the table during the development, as were people from U.S. courts, Harvard, the Library of Congress. So it's not blaming the PDF community. This is what we wanted, but it reflects this world that we were living in 2005. it's developed during this period of normalization and bit preservation, and it does ensure long-term accessibility and integrity of electronic documents, and it still does that. It preserves static visual appearance. It provides a self-contained device-independent package, self-documenting with metadata. It accomplished this by restricting what you could do. It prohibited features that were believed to be detrimental to long-term digital preservation. And I give this example. There are a limited number of filters supported by PDFA. So if you had a GIF, a motion GIF that you wanted to preserve, you couldn't drag and drop it into a PDFA file. You had to make a decision, and that might involve converting it to a static JPEG, which would be supported. You had to embed fonts. You still have to embed fonts, which is good. It makes sense. You want everybody to see the same thing, regardless of what font libraries they have on their computers. And it restricted external dependencies that might affect visual appearance. And so ECMAScript or JavaScript calls pulling stuff in would not be allowed. So, in summary, repositories attempted to limit the number of formats that they were responsible for. There was a preference for static content due to the complexities and size of audio and video files. At the National Archives, the transfer guidance didn't include any audio or video formats, but rather it was expected that if an agency wanted to preserve what happened in a meeting, they would provide a written transcript that would be preserved. Minimal external dependencies. And if you think about that, if you're cauterizing your content, you're making decisions on what you consider is important. And oftentimes that means you're getting an incomplete record because you've cut things off and chosen this rather than that. Preservation's just through copying the bits. There's no continuous monitoring for corruption or alteration. And at least where I worked, the bit verification was only done when you're refreshing the tapes. So it was kind of this slow, laborious process. So let's flash forward to 2025. Things are very, very different. I planted that flag back when AWS and Google come along. And so now we have cloud-based storage for digital preservation, and you can tier it. So you have offline, online, nearline. You can store in different geographic regions. And in fact, somebody, I can't remember her name, but posited that perfect digital preservation would mean storing your content in 3 different repository types, in 3 different geographic regions under 3 different political systems. And you could do that today rather than having a copy on a shelf in one building and a copy on a shelf in another building. You have much greater possibilities for preservation. We have these domain-specific metadata standards that support preservation through time, and I'm going to use METS and Premise. METS, people love it because it offers a structure map where you can describe interrelated content. And so now, with these abilities, the preference isn't to normalize anymore, but rather to capture content in its original format. And that's even if it's an obsolete or difficult format. I give the examples of Macromedia Flash, WordStar, and Lotus 123. So rather than expecting people to normalize into a trusted format, repositories would rather get that and take action themselves in the future to ensure that they have the authentic record. We now have the ability to manage multiple versions of the same content, and METS and Premise give us the language to differentiate between them in our repositories. And we have the ability to capture related content. A very common implementation for PDF here allows you to go and capture a website and specify how many levels deep you would like it to be preserved. So that idea of kind of cauterizing things and cutting them off is no longer the preferential way forward for digital preservation. I mentioned the impact of the cloud. And so, in the past, in 2005, content tended to be in binary formats that, I give the example of you could click your mouse cursor on them, drag them around, save it to a floppy disk, hand that off. But now, rather than things like TIFF and WordPerfect, it all exists in the cloud. And so, I used Google Workspace in the development of this. And, I can't pull down a Google Doc and interact with that Google Doc on my desktop. I can't pull down the Google slide deck and interact with it. I have to make a choice about one of the formats Google allows me to save it as, a PowerPoint or a Word document. This is very troublesome for the digital preservation community. How do you capture the most authentic copy of something that doesn't have a open, well, even published format? And not only that, but you can't get a copy of it in that format. And that's one of the things I see a real opportunity for PDFA in the future. This absence of a binary format, there's still a need today. There may not be forever, but today there's still a need to be able to capture content in a trusted format. I throw in there format identification. I mentioned repositories are really interested in being able to identify what it is that they're responsible for caring for through time. And tools have improved. Apache Tika, Vera PDF, which this community is familiar with, Droid and Trid. But beyond just identifying the content, understanding what it contains is still a problem. There have been examples recently of personally identifiable information being inside of attachments to other documents, and parsing through that data, it can be laborious and expensive, and the tools still aren't great at it. So I couldn't resist using this image, sorry. Some of the pros and cons of PDFA. You can store a lot of different types of data in a PDFA, and it still accomplishes all of those original missions of preserving static appearance really, really well. But, as I mentioned, it still kind of puts forward that normalization worldview of oftentimes you have to make a decision of how you're going to get your content in there. If you have a motion GIF, what are you going to do? What's the least bad option for you? And despite all of the rich metadata options you have, to the digital preservation community, it can resemble one of these boxes where if it doesn't have a clear label on it, it can be really difficult to figure out and identify the ones you want. If you're an organization that brings in forms, scan text, 3D content, and you're interested in identifying everything with PRC 3D models inside it, parsing across your cloud storage, going through dictionaries, is a lot of CPU calls. So now we get to the why am I excited part of the presentation. And one of the things, I've been sitting in these meeting rooms kind of wishing we could go back and blow up PDF and start from scratch. And Leonard has patiently explained to me why that's not going to happen ever. And with good reason. Backward compatibility, the relationship between all of the different PDF specifications makes it very, very complicated to make any changes. And I've come to see that really doesn't need to be a change in the standards, but rather the community needs to get together and define how the standards should be used. And I see that as a key for digital preservation moving forward. And I give a couple of examples. Is anyone in the room involved with EAPDF? Or, damn it. EAPDF is a specification that was developed saying how to capture email records in PDFA. Pretty much any email client would give you the opportunity to pull down an email as a PDF file. But if you're looking at it with the RFC defining email in your hand, it's not a great representation. And so a lot of the work that went on with EAPDF was to figure that out, like how should email, email is really complex. But that work went on, and I see that as a really great model moving forward for lots of other tricky kind of cloud-based content like text messages, social media records. Part of the email problem is you have these threads and exchanges with multiple people. And having figured out that model for email, it can be applied to lots of other record types. When I was at the National Archives, we worked with members of the PDF Association to develop guidance around PDF collections or portfolios. And as I talked about the difficulty in understanding the contents of attachments, and here are these things. It's lots of different disparate content types in a PDF. But working on guidance so that agencies can use these things, as they do day to day, and then transfer them, and a repository would know how to manage them. And I think this is the first time I mentioned CTPA, content provenance and authenticity, and I suspect we're going to hear a lot about that this week. But I'm also involved in a group being run by the Library of Congress, and that G+LAM is Government plus Libraries, Archives, and Museums, who are looking to define how CTPA can be used in that community to take most advantage of it, and giving feedback to the CTPA group on how we feel, so having kind of a voice in its development. And then also this week, there will be WG10 meeting, which is this DocRM, which was mentioned earlier, which is defining if you're preserving documents into a PDF PDFA file, how should that be done consistently? And so these are just examples of, beyond the standard steps that can be taken to make PDFA a more digital preservation friendly format. So this is just why am I so excited? These things are kind of obvious. Wide native support across hardware and software environments. You can pick up a cell phone with some obscure operating system and open a PDF on it. It's utterly ubiquitous. It's everywhere. It's still everywhere. In terms of the digital preservation community, I don't think you can underestimate the importance of it being an ISO standard with international oversight and development. So there is this consistency in the standards moving forward. Changes aren't made willy-nilly. There's a lot of thought that goes into any changes. Declarations. How many people here are familiar with declarations? Okay, talk to Duff. Go to the PDF Association site. It is a method of making a metadata declaration which ties back to the PDF Association site, which is a registry. And they use the example, they've already done HIPAA, which is health information, privacy. And I see this as part of the solution to that warehouse full of boxes is if people start incorporating declarations and tying things back to other external standards, it will be really helpful for repositories in the future. PDFR. How many people are familiar with PDFR? Couple. All right. You're in the right place. PDFR is PDF raster, which I'm incredibly excited about. It kind of extends PDF back earlier in the life cycle, and I'll talk about it more in a minute. Rich media, there's a lot of work going on to be able to capture more content types inside PDF and PDFA. 3D PDF, I'm part of that group. PDFA4 gives us the ability, a home for 3D content in a PDFA wrapper. EAPDF I've mentioned, better tools. The PDF Association white papers, recently I was involved in the development one on hidden data. I talked about no external calls that affect visual appearance, but of course there can be external calls, and that's all documented. And then all the LWGs and TWGs that are meeting to continually improve and discuss things. There's a GitHub where anybody can go and raise an issue and get a response. And then, of course, C2PA, content provenance and authenticity. This is just a list of things that I see as contributing to making PDFA a really exciting digital preservation format. And now, okay, So I mentioned early on Premise as this metadata dictionary for the digital preservation community. And for years, I was a member of the editorial committee for a chunk of time. And a lot of the work of that group is describing the events. I talked about most PDFs, I don't know if you agree or disagree with this statement, but they don't begin, you don't sit down at Acrobat and start typing a letter into a PDF. I would put forward that a large number are scanned from documents or converted from Word documents or whatever it is, but they begin their life somewhere else. And that event of their conversion into a PDF or capture into a PDF traditionally isn't well recorded. And so Premise has been developed, but it's usually only used by repositories once they get their hands on stuff. The goal has been, how can we push this out in the life cycle? And that's really complicated. So here you can see this is just some of the metadata schema describing events. And then let's switch back over to C2PA. C2PA incorporates actions assertions. Very similar concept to Premise events. And you can see some of the examples. This is a random one of the tables. Something was redacted, something was removed, something was repackaged, resized. And so the ability to capture the events that occur in the life of a PDF from the moment it's created is incredibly exciting to the digital preservation community. And I'm doing a poster session, I guess, after this, on behalf of that group, the Government Plus Libraries, Archives, and Museum, and we're actually in that process of doing a data mapping between Premise and C2PA assertions. And work has been done on C2PA with raster images, but for PDF, that work is in front of us. So we're looking forward to having a seat at the table in those conversations about what action should be recorded for documents. So here is a random slide. I could have done a number, I could have done social media, I could have done email, but I'm just using this example. I spoke at a Twain meeting last year, and I put forward, scanner support by the Twain organization for PDFR is wonderful. You can output from a chip a PDFR file and put that in a PDF file. I would like to see PDFR2, where there are supports for additional codecs so you can do things like color. But if you think about that, at that point, something coming off the chip when you push scan is born a PDF. There is no normalization of any kind going on. You know everything that has happened to that file. And then if you tie that to C2PA, where you've recorded it, and then you use declarations to tie it back to some external standard that you're complying with, and wrap it all up in a PDFA file, you have the perfect preservation file. You know everything that went into its construction, whereas in the past we would get, distiller was used or whatever it would. Was this a WordPerfect document or a Word document? All of that goes out the window. And so, I was joking with Duff. I considered naming my presentation PDF A Love Story. But I really do see this opportunity for PDF moving forward to step in and become what my colleagues and I talk about, small A archiving and big A archiving. And so PDFA could go from small A archiving into this really being a digital preservation format. So that's it for me. Thank you all. Any questions?
Based on the forums, forums group.
Right.
I was discussing with Duff about what the benefits are for the forums, and they are also busy to look for a new solution for the PDF
right.
forms. So maybe in combination with JSON. But I was also marked for the benefit of the forms. The major benefit is to store data or private data in one file. That's compared to a web form. You also have another extra application to store extra data, so it costs more work to do that. And I hear a lot of question. Why do we need a PDF form instead of we have a web form? Yes, that's the benefit. In what way PDFR can do some help to that?
I'm not sure if I'm the right person to speak deeply about PDFR. If you think about it, as I understand it, it was developed to replace TIFF, on a format that cameras or scanners are producing. It's always been a question. If you scan a document and say, save it as a PDF-A file, what's happened to it in that process? What codec did the scanner actually encode it as, and what steps did it take in the pathway to a PDF-A file? And that's been, an unknown, unless you did the research yourself to figure out, this scanner manufacturer, what do they do, how do they encode? So that, my view of PDFR is you have this understanding of exactly what the chip created and anything that happened to it on its way to that end state as a PDF-A file. I'm afraid that's not a great answer to your question, but that's... Yes.
But in the forms, you have data already.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
And that's why the data is in PDF. And in the web form, you have also data, but you also have an extra application to store that.
Yeah, and that...
A lot of effort.
Maybe C2PA comes into play there in describing the origin of all the data in your PDF. Yes.
Yeah, as in your training working group, I'm happy that you mentioned PDFR, of course. Maybe more an answer than a question. If you want to see more scanners directly producing PDFR, please tell your scanner vendors, because adoption is not as fast as we hoped for.
Yeah.
As you said, many benefits of scanners directly producing PDF on chip. And so it would be great if more users ask for scanner vendors to produce the Twain standard. It's a free standard, right? Instead of vendor proprietary solutions, because scanner vendors like to do some proprietary solutions. So the more people ask for open standards in PDFR, the more scanners you can use it directly.
So that'll be...
if there are questions to PDFR, I'm of course here to answer later after the talk.
Great. It's good to see you again. It's been a while. Yes.
I'm wondering, I'm not a preservation expert, but from your presentation, it sounded like you welcome the fact that more and more technologies and related standards and formats will be supported within PDF. And I'm really honestly just wondering, the more technology a PDF file format has to support, the more complex it will become to implement software that actually supports all that stuff. Even today already, we know that not every viewer views every PDF correctly. Not every PDF itself is created correctly. And the more capabilities we push into that format, the harder this gets. How does the preservation, how does that look like from a preservation point of view? It only gets more complex, really.
Yeah, and complexity introduces risk. I'll use the example of the work we did in EA PDF, where there was thought to this, and they kind of built into the specification. You can have an EA PDF aware viewer that'll understand the specification, but if you throw it at an old viewer, you'll see this. And I think that's part of the solution, is just the transparency and what to expect depending on the viewer you use. the reality is that with the introduction of PDF-A3, you can attach anything to a PDF-A file. And so that problem of dealing with other content has been there since PDF-A3. Formalizing it, and I'm part of the imaging group looking at new codecs, and I understand, that dream of like drag and drop anything and it's going to wind up in there not realistic and not even desirable. But I think the thoughtful work of the 3D group in looking, since when I joined, it was U3D and PRC, and now we have STEP, and we're looking at additional ones, and doing that kind of work to make it possible to bring in more and more so that conversion or normalization is minimized or controlled very tightly is kind of a future. But I understand your question, and it's tricky.
It's this what I kind of perceive as a conflict, because this normalization, I understand you lose quality maybe, or even truth in a way by doing that. On the other hand, it feels like that's exactly what guarantees you the longevity, because certain formats are well understood and will be well understood in 50 years. Some formats might just go away, and in 50 years then you have to deal with 100 formats instead of just 3. So
yeah. These are the things people, I brought up social media, and there is no binary representation, and I've seen lots of different attempts to output social media as HTML or PDFs or whatever, JSON with attachments, and it's messy to try and recreate that experience. And so I think similar to the work that the EA PDF group did, if you think about it, you can put it in a PDF and kind of recreate that Instagram or Facebook experience, but it takes a lot of thought and a lot of work, but it's possible.
All right, any other questions? Do I see any hands? No? All right, then give it again a big applause for Kevin.